7 million tons a year, and Burkina Faso can still run short of cement. On paper, the country has enough capacity to meet domestic demand. Yet somewhere between that capacity and the construction site, the system is losing the result. So where does the cement disappear? Is the headline capacity bigger than real output? Is the problem hiding before production begins? Or is the cement being made but failing to reach the market when and where it is needed? We are going to follow that chain and eliminate those possibilities one by one. Because by the end, the real question will not be how many cement factories Burkina Faso has. It will be whether the country controls the system that makes cement available. 7 million tons of annual capacity should make shortages almost impossible. At least that is what the headline suggests. Burkina Faso's government says the country now has enough installed cement capacity to satisfy domestic demand and still leave room for exports. Yet in 2026, shortages and price pressure were serious enough that officials publicly intervened. So the first question is obvious. If the factories are big enough, are they actually producing enough? Capacity is only a ceiling. It tells you what plants are designed to make under the right conditions. It does not tell you how many hours they run, how often, production stops, how much material reaches the grinding line, or how much finished cement leaves the gate. That distinction matters because a country can look oversupplied on paper and still feel undersupplied on the ground. Imagine a plant rated to produce 1 million tons a year. If it loses power, waits for a critical input, slows a line for maintenance, or cannot move enough finished cement out by truck, the nameplate number does not change. The market does. And that gives us our first suspect, the gap between rated capacity and real output. But there is a problem with stopping there. The shortage did not appear in a vacuum. Burkina Faso is building aggressively. Roads, housing, public works, and private construction all compete for the same bags of cement. In July, the government itself said the acceleration of construction had put strong pressure on materials, including cement. So maybe the factories are producing reasonably well, and demand simply rose faster than expected. That would explain part of the pressure. But it still would not explain why a country with such a large theoretical cushion could experience repeated scarcity. Which means we need a second suspect, distribution. A bag of cement sitting inside a plant is not supply to a builder. It still has to be loaded, transported, stored, distributed, and sold in the right region at the right time. A national total can look comfortable while one city has stock and another is waiting. Now think about what that does to price. When availability becomes uncertain, contractors buy earlier, distributors hold more inventory, buyers compete for the same deliveries. Speculation becomes easier because scarcity, real or expected, changes behavior before the system has time to rebalance. And there is another clue. When officials investigated the disruption, they did not point to one simple cause. Their diagnosis crossed several different parts of the chain. That matters because a shortage created by several small failures behaves very differently from a shortage created by one factory that simply needs to produce more. If you want Burkina Faso's industrial progress measured by what actually reaches the market, not just by the capacity printed on a factory brochure, tell us where you are watching from and subscribe as we follow this chain. Because the cement problem cannot be solved by looking at one factory. We have to follow the entire system. And this is where the government's own response becomes interesting. Instead of simply waiting for the market to correct itself, Burkina Faso created SAHEL, a new mixed ownership company with the state holding the majority share. The stated goal is not only to strengthen cement supply, but also to improve availability, reduce price pressure, and give the government a stronger role in a strategic sector. That sounds like an answer, but it creates another question. If Burkina Faso already has enough theoretical capacity, why is more production capacity part of the solution? Either the existing capacity is not becoming real output, or the bottleneck sits somewhere the factory numbers do not show. And before we decide which one is true, we need to look at what a cement factory actually needs before it can make a single bag. Because the most important part of Burkina Faso's cement problem may begin before the cement exists. Before cement becomes a bag on a construction site, it has to become something else first. That something is clinker. Most buyers never see it. It does not arrive at a hardware shop with a brand name on the bag. But without it, most conventional cement plants have nothing to grind into the product builders actually use. The chain is simpler than it sounds. Raw materials are prepared and heated at very high temperature inside a kiln. What comes out is clinker hard nodular material that stores much of the chemistry needed for cement. That clinker is then cooled, transported, ground with gypsum and other permitted materials, and turned into finished cement. That distinction changes how we should read Burkina Faso's 7 million ton capacity headline. Because not every cement plant controls every stage of that chain. A country can have large grinding capacity without producing every ton of clinker itself. It can perform the final industrial steps locally while still relying on a major upstream input from somewhere else. And this is where the first real reveal appears. In 2024, Burkina Faso imported about 2.42 million tons of cement clinker. Not finished bags of cement, clinker. That is a huge physical flow moving into a landlocked country before much of the finished cement can even exist. And now the 7 million ton headline looks different. Burkina Faso has clearly built meaningful downstream cement capability. Plants can grind, blend bag, and distribute cement domestically. That keeps more activity inside the country than simply importing finished cement. But the clinker number tells us that at least part of the system still begins outside Burkina Faso. That matters economically too. Grinding, bagging, warehousing, and distribution create local jobs and local business activity, so importing clinker is not the same as importing a finished bag. But it also means the country has not necessarily captured the most energy-intensive upstream stage. The industrial ladder has been climbed, but we do not yet know how close Burkina Faso is to the top. We need to be careful here. The trade data does not tell us what percentage of all clinker used by Burkina Faso's cement industry was imported. It does not prove that every cement plant depends on imported clinker. And it does not tell us how much clinker Burkina Faso produced domestically in the same year. So the correct conclusion is narrower. 2.42 million tons of clinker imports is evidence of a significant upstream exposure. It is not evidence that Burkina Faso has no domestic clinker capability. That difference matters because otherwise we would make the same mistake we made with factory capacity, turning one large number into a conclusion it cannot support. But the number still forces a new question. What happens when a country has enough equipment to grind cement, but part of the material feeding those grinders has to cross borders before production can begin? A delay does not need to shut every factory to create pressure. If one plant receives input, late production can slow. If another has stock, it can continue. If demand is rising at the same time, a relatively small disruption can become much more visible by the time cement reaches distributors. Now think about the geography. Burkina Faso is landlocked. Imported clinker does not simply appear at a factory gate. It has to move through a regional transport chain before reaching the plant. That means the cement system starts long before the grinding mill turns. And yet this still does not solve our mystery, because importing clinker does not automatically create a cement shortage. A plant can import clinker and still produce reliably. A country can depend on foreign inputs and still keep shelves supplied if logistics, inventory, energy, and distribution are managed well. So clinker is not the final answer. It is the first bottleneck we can actually see. And that is the payoff to the first question from the beginning of this video. Burkina Faso's cement problem is not simply a lack of factories. The country has substantial capacity to perform the downstream stages of cement production, but the system also depends on an upstream flow that factory capacity numbers do not reveal. Capacity tells us how much the machines could produce. Clinker tells us whether there is something available for those machines to process. But even if the clinker arrives on time, one more thing has to happen before a builder sees a single bag. The plant has to keep running, and the cement has to move. So the next question is no longer what Burkina Faso can theoretically make. It is where exactly the real tons get stuck. Now follow 1 ton of cement through the system, not the 7 million ton headline. 1 real ton that has to reach a construction site. Its journey may begin before it is cement at all. If the plant depends on imported clinker, that material first has to cross a regional trade route, clear customs and transit procedures, reach Burkina Faso, and arrive at the plant with enough inventory left to keep production moving. And this is our first hard clue. When Burkina Faso's authorities explained the 2026 cement disruption, they specifically pointed to delays in customs and transit procedures. That matters because a grinding line cannot process material that is still waiting somewhere upstream. But suppose the clinker arrives. The mystery is still not solved. The plant now needs energy. Grinding cement is an industrial process. Motors, mills, conveyors, compressors, bagging systems, and other equipment cannot simply work around an unreliable energy supply. And the government identified energy supply difficulties affecting cement plants as another source of disruption. So now we have 2 different failures that can produce the same result. The factory may be large enough. The demand may be there, but the plant can still produce less than its nameplate capacity because either the input arrives late or the machinery cannot run consistently. That helps explain why capacity and output can drift apart, but even that is not enough. Assume the plant has clinker. Assume the power stays on. Assume cement is ground, blended, and bagged. The bags are still inside the factory. Now, they need a truck. And here the official diagnosis gives us a third clue. Authorities said the available supply of trucks had fallen partly because vehicles that did not comply with size rules had been taken out of circulation. Think about what that means. A cement plant can have product ready to sell, while a contractor hundreds of kilometers away experiences a shortage. National production can rise while local availability remains tight. The factory sees inventory. The builder sees an empty supplier. Both can be true at the same time. Then demand enters the picture. Burkina Faso is in the middle of an intense construction push. Roads, buildings, public works, and private projects all consume cement. In July, the government said the pace of construction had placed strong pressure on cement bitumen and crushed stone. Now the system becomes much easier to understand. You do not need one catastrophic failure. A delay at the border reduces input flexibility. An energy interruption reduces plant output. Fewer trucks slow distribution. At the same time, construction demand rises. Each problem alone may be manageable. Together, they can create scarcity. And scarcity changes behavior. A contractor who is afraid of running out may buy earlier. A distributor may hold more stock. A buyer who finds cement available today may take more than immediately needed because tomorrow is uncertain. Once expectations change, the physical shortage and the fear of shortage can begin reinforcing each other. This is also where speculation becomes easier. But we should be careful. The existence of speculation does not prove that traders created the shortage. Government sources describe speculation as part of the market problem while also identifying real logistical energy and demand pressures. So there is no need to invent a conspiracy. The system already has enough friction to explain why cement can become difficult to find. And now we can return to 2 hypothetical builders in different parts of the country. One is close to a major plant and a large distributor. Trucks can reach him quickly. He may see only a price increase or a short delay. The other is farther from production and depends on fewer transport links, longer routes, and fewer delivery options. One missing truck or one delayed shipment can become several days without cement. Same national capacity, different reality. This is the point where the 7 million ton number finally loses its power to explain the market by itself. National capacity tells us what the industrial base could produce. It does not tell us what each plant actually produced this month. It does not tell us whether inputs arrived on time. And it does not tell us whether the finished cement reached every region. Now the government's decision to create SAHEL becomes much more interesting. Because if the real problem were simply Burkina Faso needs another cement factory, the answer would be straightforward. But the government's own diagnosis points to a chain problem. So what exactly is SAHEL supposed to fix? More tons of better market control, more reliable supply chain, lower prices, or some combination of all four? That is the question we have to answer next. Because adding another producer only solves the shortage if it strengthens the part of the system that is actually failing. By now, the cement shortage no longer looks like a factory problem. It looks like a chain problem. And that makes Burkina Faso's next move unusually important. In July 2026, the government created SAHEL, a new cement company in which the state holds the majority stake. Its stated mission is broader than simply producing more cement. The government says it wants the company to improve availability across the country, push back against speculation, support construction, and help stabilize prices. That sounds almost perfectly matched to the crisis. Almost. Because creating a new producer only fixes the system if it reaches the bottlenecks we have just followed. If clinker is delayed upstream, a new grinding line still needs material. If energy supply interrupts production, another plant still needs reliable power. If trucks are scarce, another ton leaving a factory can still fail to reach a distant builder. And if demand is rising faster than distribution can respond, more national capacity may improve the headline before it improves the market. So the question is no longer will SAHEL produce cement. The harder question is what capability is the government actually trying to build? The ownership structure gives us one clue. SAHEL was created with 5 billion CFA francs in capital, with 60% held by the state and 40% by private partners. The government later announced a separate 15 billion CFA financing agreement intended to strengthen national cement production capacity. But those numbers are not the payoff. The payoff is what they reveal about the strategy. Burkina Faso is not treating cement as an ordinary private commodity anymore. It is trying to create a public lever inside a market the government considers strategic. That lever could be used in several ways. SAHEL could add physical production. It could give the state more visibility into supply. It could create another source of cement when private producers face disruption. And if distribution is built into the model, it could potentially help move cement toward regions where availability is weakest. But those are intended functions, not verified results. The company has not yet proven that shortages will disappear, that prices will fall, or that every bottleneck in the chain will be solved. And this is where the diagnosis has to remain ahead of the celebration. If the shortage was caused only by insufficient factory capacity, then another producer would be an obvious answer. But the government's own explanation tells us the system is more complicated than that. Inputs matter. Energy matters. Transport matters. Division matters. Demand matters. So SAHEL will only become a real solution if it strengthens enough of those links at the same time. That distinction is larger than cement. A country can build factories and still lack industrial capability. Industrial capability appears when the factory can get its inputs, keep its machines running, move its output, maintain quality, and deliver the product at a price the market can actually absorb. And that gives us the midpoint answer. Burkina Faso's cement shortage is not evidence that the country has failed to build cement capacity. It is evidence that capacity alone is not the same thing as a functioning cement system. SAHEL may become part of that system, but whether it actually changes the outcome cannot be judged by its creation, its capital, or the size of a financing agreement. It has to be judged by what happens after the ribbon cutting. Do plants run closer to their real potential? Does cement reach more regions reliably? Do shortages become less frequent? And does the country move further upstream instead of simply expanding the final stage of production? Those questions take us to the next level of the story. Because Burkina Faso is not starting from zero. It has already climbed part of the industrial ladder. The real question now is how many steps remain. The shortage tells us something important. Burkina Faso is not at the beginning of the cement story. It has already moved beyond simply importing finished bags. So the real question is not whether the country has an industry. It is how far that industry has climbed. Think of cement capability as a ladder. At the bottom is the simplest model import finished cement and sell it. Most of the value is created somewhere else. The next step is stronger import clinker, then grind blend bag and distribute cement locally. Burkina Faso has clearly built significant capability at this level. Local plants create jobs, operate mills, and bagging lines handle quality control, warehousing, and distribution. More value stays inside the country. But the 2.42 million tons of clinker imported in 2024 tells us the ladder does not end there. The next step is producing more clinker domestically. That is much harder. Clinker production requires raw material control kilns, enormous heat-reliable energy, maintenance technical skill, and continuous operation. And this is where the challenge deepens. A grinding plant can stop because clinker does not arrive. A clinker plant can stop because energy spare parts or maintenance fail. So the next rung is not simply make clinker. It is control the systems that keep heavy industry running. Reliable power. Technicians who can diagnose failures. Spare parts that can be obtained before a shutdown becomes a crisis. Preventive maintenance that keeps machines operating. A country does not control an industry simply because the factory sits inside its borders. It controls more of that industry when the factory can keep running without every disruption becoming an external emergency. Then comes distribution. This may sound less impressive than a kiln, but for the builder, it is just as important. Cement that cannot leave the plant is economically incomplete. A mature system needs trucks, predictable routes, warehouses, regional distributors, and enough market visibility to see shortages forming before prices spike. Only when those capabilities work together does the 7 million ton headline begin to mean what people assume it means. And there is one final rung: reliable surplus. If Burkina Faso can consistently meet domestic demand, keep plants operating, reduce upstream exposure, move cement across the country, and still produce more than the market needs, then exports stop being a theoretical possibility. They become evidence that the system is working beyond its minimum requirement. So where is Burkina Faso today? The evidence suggests it is somewhere in the middle of this ladder. It has substantial local grinding and finishing capacity. It has a real domestic cement industry, but large clinker imports, energy disruptions, and distribution problems show that several higher capabilities remain incomplete or vulnerable. That is not failure. It is a more precise diagnosis. And precision matters because the wrong diagnosis creates the wrong investment. If the bottleneck is clinker, another grinding line may not solve it. If the bottleneck is energy, more installed cement capacity may sit idle. If the bottleneck is trucks, more production can accumulate in the wrong place. The next industrial leap may therefore be less visible than another factory. It may be a kiln that runs reliably, a maintenance team that fixes equipment locally, a logistics network that moves cement before shortages appear, or domestic clinker supply large enough to reduce upstream exposure. Those are not glamorous headlines, but they are the capabilities that turn factories into an industry. And now this stops being a story about industrial policy and becomes a story about ordinary people. Because a builder does not buy capacity, a truck driver does not transport a policy target, and a family does not build a home with a national production headline. They build with bags of cement that have to be available, affordable, and delivered on time. For a builder, 7 million tons means nothing. He does not buy national capacity. He buys bags. If cement is available at the right price and arrives when his crew needs it, the system feels healthy. If the supplier says come back next week, then the national production headline disappears immediately. That is the first ordinary life test. Imagine a small contractor working on a school, a shop, or a family home. He has workers scheduled, sand-delivered blocks, ready, and a deadline that does not move. Then the cement truck does not arrive. One delayed shipment does more than stop concrete work. Labor sits idle. Equipment waits. A project that was supposed to take 1 week stretches into 2. The contractor either absorbs the cost or passes it forward. And that is how an industrial bottleneck becomes a housing cost. Now follow the truck. To the factory, transport can look like the final step. To the market, it is part of production. A ton of cement that cannot move is not useful supply. The trucker has his own constraints: fuel, vehicle condition, loading time, road conditions, regulation, and the simple question of whether enough trucks are available when demand spikes. If several plants are producing while transport capacity tightens, the country can experience something that looks contradictory from a distance. More cement may exist. Less cement may be available where people need it. That difference between production and availability is easy to miss because national statistics flatten geography. A plant near a major city can serve nearby buyers quickly. A more distant region may depend on fewer distributors, longer routes, and fewer delivery options. The same national market can therefore contain both surplus and scarcity at the same time. And then there is the family. A family planning to build a home does not experience clinker imports, utilization rates, or industrial policy. They experience the final price of a bag. If cement becomes difficult to find, the effects spread through everything built with it. A wall costs more. A repair gets postponed. A small house requires a larger budget. A contractor raises a quote. A public project needs more money to finish the same structure. Even rent can eventually feel the pressure when construction becomes more expensive. This is why the cement mystery matters beyond the cement industry. Cement sits underneath roads, schools, hospitals, houses, drainage, factories, warehouses, and much of the infrastructure Burkina Faso is trying to build at the same time. If that material becomes unreliable, the cost of transformation rises. And this is where the 7 million ton headline faces its hardest test. The country may have enough theoretical capacity, it may have factories, it may have a new state-backed company, but the builder only cares whether the bags arrive. The trucker only cares whether the system can move them. The family only cares whether the final price still makes construction possible. Those three experiences tell us more about industrial capability than a factory photograph ever could. And they point directly to the final question. How do we know when Burkina Faso has actually solved the cement problem? Not when another plan is announced, not when national capacity rises again. We need evidence that the existing capacity is becoming real output, and evidence that the country is controlling more of the critical input behind that output. Those are the two measurements that can turn this story from a headline into a verdict. And they are what we need to look at next. So what would prove that Burkina Faso has actually solved the cement problem? Not another factory announcement, not another increase in theoretical capacity. Two measurements matter more. The first is utilization. How much cement is actually produced each year compared with the 6 to 7 million ton capacity the country says it has? If the plants are operating close to their potential, then the capacity headline is real. If actual output remains far below that ceiling, then more factories may not be the first problem to solve. The second measurement is upstream control. How much of the clinker used by Burkina Faso's cement industry is produced inside the country? That number matters because clinker sits before grinding, bagging, and distribution. A country can control the final stages of cement production while still remaining exposed to a critical input from outside. Those two numbers tell us much more than the number of cement plants. Actual output tells us whether the industrial base is really operating. Domestic clinker share tells us how much of the chain Burkina Faso actually controls. And together, they change how we should judge the shortage. Here is what we can verify today. Burkina Faso has substantial cement production capacity. The government has publicly acknowledged shortages and price pressure. Authorities have identified disruptions involving transit, energy transport, and rising demand. Large clinker imports are real. And the government has created SAHEL as a new state majority player intended to strengthen supply and improve market availability. But several things remain unproven. We do not yet have a reliable public figure showing how much of national capacity is being used across the whole industry. We do not know the domestic share of total clinker consumption. We do not yet know whether SAHEL will materially reduce shortages, stabilize prices, or deepen local upstream production. Those are not small details. They are the difference between capacity on paper and capability in practice. So the next time Burkina Faso announces another cement project, the most useful questions will be simple. Did actual national output rise? Did plants run more reliably? Did clinker imports fall relative to domestic supply? Did cement become easier to find across the country? And did the price become more predictable for builders and families? If those indicators improve together, Burkina Faso is not simply adding factories. It is climbing the capability ladder. If they do not, the country may continue increasing the number printed on its industrial balance sheet, while the same shortage reappears at the construction site. So here is the final question. If Burkina Faso already has enough theoretical cement capacity, should the next priority be another factory, or should the country focus first on clinker, reliable energy and distribution? Share your view below. Because 7 million tons of capacity means very little if the bags still do not arrive. A factory can make cement. A country has to make the whole chain work.